welcome to Getting to Know You. That is residents and staff at Stonebridge. And I'm delighted to introduce two relatively new residents to Stonebridge, who I think are going to help us get out of our nice cozy place here with the snow outside and the sun shining, and thinking about where we might want to go some other time. They have really some wonderful adventures to tell us about. So I want you to meet Ann Bastian and Al Howard. And first I'm going to ask them to tell us what they did in professional life, and then we'll talk about the adventures they had. So Ann, I'm going to start with you. What did you do when you were out there working?
I had a lot of different jobs, especially early, but I became a senior program officer at the New World Foundation, and I traveled around the country looking for grassroots groups working on social justice issues, and then I helped them develop their work and became a bit of a circuit rider connecting them to each other.
Okay, now Al, will you reveal what you did?
Well, I was
Your
a teacher
professional life.
at African history for 41 years at Rutgers University in New Brunswick.
So what did that mean? Did you teach courses on African history or
I did
current
teach
affairs,
courses
or?
on African history, and with my friend Michael Otis, I developed a world history course as well, both African history and world history,
Right.
which incorporated African,
African.
was incorporated into the world.
And then did you get to know students from Africa?
I did. I had many students from Africa, as well as many students from the United States. And of course, the majority are from New Jersey, as you might expect, because it was State University of New Jersey. And I first taught there in 1969, so that adds up to 41 years before I retired. Even after I retired, I kept teaching for a while, and the last course I taught was in 2013.
And a lot's been happening in Africa. You could start again.
I should, maybe. I'm not a political scientist. I don't know the contemporary history as well as the past history.
Well, we'll get to how you got around in the world, because Ann, tell us about your traveling around the country. A lot of us have, I know at dinner people talk about whether they've been to every capital in the States or which national park. Where did you go?
So one of the things I loved about my work was that it took me to places I probably wouldn't have gone. I did travel for national parks, and I did travel to see family. I started out as a kid in San Francisco and grew up in California. So I made sure that my work got me back there very often. And of course I ended up living in New York and New Jersey and working from New York. And just a quick summary, I guess, is I ended up going in the 80s to the upper Midwest and the Great Plains. I think a place I wouldn't have looked at so closely, but there was a strong family farm movement in the 80s trying to preserve family farms from corporatization. And there were wonderful groups all across the upper Midwest. And at one point I traveled from Minneapolis to Seattle, stopping all along the way in small towns and farm country, meeting with folks. That's when I discovered some fabulous national parks, and took an extra day or two. Took an extra day or two along the way. Later, I did work around environmental justice organizing in the early 80s and into the 90s, and certainly very much today.
Yeah.
There's environmental justice organizing all across the country, and a lot of it has to do with toxics and including plants being placed next to low-income communities of color. And that happens, as we know, in New Jersey, Newark being an example. But I did a lot of funding in the Gulf Coast. So I was down in Louisiana.
Oh, I think, okay.
Not a bad place to eat while you're traveling, but also in Alabama, Mississippi, a little bit in Texas. Another portfolio that I developed was immigrant worker centers, which were centers for new immigrant populations coming to the U.S. in the 90s from Latin America, East Asia, and those groups often had no support systems other than their mutual aid groups.
Right.
So what we found was that when they formed these organizations, they were strong community-based organizations that often were pathways to citizenship and to voting rights. So that increased a whole area of voting rights, and a lot of that work took me to Florida, to the Carolinas, and to the West Coast.
Were they all small towns, or was it
Some were in
related to
very
the
large cities. I mean, for instance, south of Miami is a huge agricultural area that produces trees for landscaping. There's a very, Homestead, it's a very big colony of new migrants. But there's pathways in migration that go from Florida up the coast to New Jersey, from Mexico into the Midwest and to California, and from California to the Midwest to the east. So I would follow the migrant paths. Many folks had ended up in cities, but then fanned out again to do the agricultural work. So I met fantastic people. I really want to emphasize that as interesting as it was to find these places, it was also fantastic to meet really admirable people building their communities. So then voting rights became a big part of our portfolio, and that focused on swing states. Spent a lot of time in swing states. I have to say that another sideline of my work was working on education, public education reform, and fighting against privatization of public education. And that took me to conferences all over the United States and in Hawaii. Very good to go to conferences in Hawaii.
That's nice.
When I finished this work, I had been to every state except Alaska. So I made a point of going to a wedding in Vancouver, actually, Canada, and hopping over for a few days to make sure that I also spent time in Alaska, which was fantastic. And I got to kayak with otters. So that's my American travel story.
You got rewarded for driving across the plains and not seeing a soul, and then finally seeing otters.
I do want to say this, as wonderful it is to see the country, and it is a great and beautiful country, there's always good stuff right at home. So I was in California once when the swallows returned to Capistrano, but I'm looking forward to the bluebirds coming back to Stonebridge.
Oh.
So you can really see things everywhere, great and small.
Right. That's sort of like our calendar. You look at all the wildflowers, they're here in New Jersey, and people go far and wide. So.
Exactly.
So, Al, you had a very different experience. If I think of it, how much territory you covered, you just went far away and stayed in one place, right?
Well, speaking of the Midwest, I was born in Wisconsin, so I grew up in the Midwest, and then I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison. That's where I have all my degrees from.
Well, that's a whole world.
I won't talk about that, though. I could, but I mostly traveled in West Africa. And then with Anne, I traveled in South Africa as well. I had never been there before, although I, like Anne, was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. But we didn't know each other then at all. In fact, we didn't know each other until fairly recently.
Oh, so when you went to West Africa, I always have to think that that's where the bulge is, right?
Yes.
And but you stayed, as I understand it, you were a teacher there, a professor, so you stayed in one place for quite a while.
I did, yes. I first went to the University of Sierra Leone in 1963. That was Forbay College, the University of Sierra Leone, because there was also an agricultural school. That's why it was a university. It was in Njala in the upcountry area. So later on, I studied in Freetown. I taught in Freetown, in Sierra Leone and Forbay College. And then I taught I did research in Port Loko and in Cambia, which were in the north central part of Sierra Leone. But I also had a good friend who was a bird watcher, and speaking of bluebirds, in West Africa there's a huge and great bird population. So I used to go with him all around the country. And I also drove a little Volkswagen all around the country, and there's a map that I think we will later on look at that has some of those routes on that I used in Sierra Leone. later on, I went to Nigeria, to Ghana, and other places in West Africa.
As a visitor.
As a traveler, as a visitor, yes. I knew some people because at Bay College at that time was all students from around West Africa. It was one of the 2 or 3 major universities. And now there are many in Nigeria alone. But at that time, many Nigerians came to Bay College, University of Sierra Leone, and other people from Gambia, for example, up the coast towards Senegal. So I also went up that way. I knew many of the students who were from Nigeria, and they introduced me to places in Nigeria. And then I had friends who were Nigerian scholars of African history, and they had been at Wisconsin or elsewhere. So I went with them too. In Nigeria, I explored the east and west and north, all areas, because I had studied them historically.
And we do have maps in this video.
Yes,
so
yeah, we do have maps.
Thanks to both of you. So what did you teach?
I taught African history in
To
Africa.
do Africa.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
People had not, this was for 1963, as I mentioned, so people did not have a familiarity with African history. They had not any schooling on that yet.
Yeah.
The school books were being written sometimes right at that time.
Right.
And
You explained to me that where you were in Sierra Leone, and it's on the map, was in a harbor that is very famous because it was from that harbor that
Yes.
slaves were brought, as Anne reminded me, to the New World, not to the United States.
Yes.
And also then it became important in World War II as a
there were, well, yes, and I've written something on that. It was very important in World War II because this harbor was very large and very deep. And so it was also a port for enslaved people up until the time of, well, about 1806, 1807, until the British Navy used that port also. And then in the Second World War, it was important for convoying to North Africa and to Europe. Ships that came from throughout the empire, the British Empire, that is. There were many empires at that time. And the British Empire, because there were submarines, and German submarines in the North Atlantic, so they used to convoy everything to, from Sierra Leone, from Freetown, the port of Freetown, north to North Africa and to Europe. And that's why it was important already in the Second World War, as well as you said, important back in the time of the enslavement of people. So it was important for a long period of time for waterways. But I primarily studied traders, and some of them were traders who had been freed off the slave ships. And their descendants mostly, and I interviewed people who were descendants 5 or 6 generations later, and they knew the history of the parents and the grandparents and so on who were traders.
One of the maps that we're going to see that I know that Jock, our great video recorder here, has already prepared is one that you made, Anne.
Oh, yeah.
She did.
And it's exactly of that harbor, right?
Yes. So for Al's 80th birthday,
Which was not too long ago, 4 years ago.
I decided I do stained glass work, and I work in mosaic as well, glass mosaic. So I thought a really fitting tribute would be to do something based on his experience in Africa, which had really been his whole adult life. So I did a Google search of that harbor and of Freetown and the Freetown Peninsula, and it was beautiful. The Google map showed a fantastic blue ocean, a very green country, those are the colors of its flag, and this beautiful mountain of a leon, a lion, sticking out in the Atlantic. So, which is, by the way, how Sierra Leone got its name. And so I decided I would try to make it into a design, and it took a long time to figure out how to make it an art piece, but I proceeded.
And they're going to be seeing it in this.
Well, that's great.
in
That's
this
great.
segment. Or maybe
So-
they have already. We don't know how it's going to be put together. But I really appreciate your sense of adventure and how much you seem to enjoy exploring. and learning new things. And I think that's a good thing for us to be thinking about at the beginning of the year. It's an opportunity, we can still learn new things. We might not
Learning.
be exploring as much on our feet or by plane or car, but there's still time for exploring. So thank you so much for telling us about your exploring and
Sure.
helping us get to know you, Anne and
That's
Al.
great.
And so, look at a
you.
map. This is the exercise that comes out of this. See what you can learn by looking at the maps where Anne and Al had all of these experiences. It's really it's a wonderful experience to travel in someone else's shoes. So thank you so much. And
Thanks.
wait for the next getting to know you. We'll see who will be introducing to you.